And good morning and welcome to another live stream summarising the ACT Chess Association online events held here in Canberra, Australia. My name is Sean Press. I organise these events on behalf of the ACT Chess Association. We're slowly winding these events down. We haven't quite got rid of them yet, but the numbers are starting to drop off as more and more face-to-face chess activities in Canberra are starting up. If you're in the Tuggeranong area of Canberra down south, Tuggeranong Chess Club meets on Monday nights at the Vikings Club at Erindale. At the moment they're only taking pre-registered entries. If you're interested in taking part in that, just look for the Tuggeranong Chess Club online and drop them a line. Canberra Chess Club meets on Thursday nights at the Hellenic Club in the city, and they're running their club championship. Again, I think they're close to capacity, but fire them off a message. The sad news is the Gungahlin Chess Club still isn't back up and running. The East Lake Football Club here at Gungahlin isn't opening up at the moment for social bookings. I was in there last night, and most of it was closed up apart from the bistro and the bar, and of course the poker machines. So we ran an 8-player tournament last night with a couple of late entries, which meant that it started with 3 rounds and finished with 3 rounds. Of course, it was won by women's FIDE master Alana Chibnall, who scored 3 out of 3. Generally a pretty convincing win, although I'm not featuring the game, but if you are following these games online on chess.com, there was a slightly embarrassing incident in the game with Miles Patterson, where a tricky little rook sack followed by bishop pin would have resulted in an equal position. Instead, Alana went on to win that game, and once she'd won that game, the tournament was pretty much in the bag. But the game I'm featuring today is one of the more deadly contests ever known in chess. You've got your famous Fischer-Spassky match, you've got Kasparov-Karpov that went forever, and you've got your Alekhine-Capablanca feud that went for decades. But there is nothing more aggressive and nothing more scary and nothing more contested as a battle between two brothers in chess. Well, not true, to be honest. Sometimes brothers will fight to the death, as in this case. Other times brothers will just be peaceful with each other and agree to draws. But in this case, it was a game between Jerry Cheng and Larry Cheng. Now, Larry is the older of the two and started playing chess first, but they're both very active players in the ACT junior scene and at street chess as well. And sometimes, as I said, some people are happy to see brothers play, or brothers and sisters, or father, son, mother, daughter, etc., etc. But other times when I've run tournaments, I've had family say, look, don't pair us together, we play enough at home. And I've run into some trouble in those circumstances, because normally when I do the pairings for chess tournaments, I actually don't pay attention to who's playing each other. As long as they haven't played before, and as long as they're on the same points, that's all I really look for. But here we go. We've got Larry is white, Jerry is black. The other reason I'm featuring this game was it wasn't a perfect game. There were mistakes either way. And it's a good example of especially how juniors play, or how anyone after about a year and a half worth of chess tends to approach the game. So we start with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4. And Jerry's been playing h6 a lot. I've seen a few of his games. Now, I'm giving it a question mark because it really is a waste of a move in most circumstances. White has a number of choices here. Most obvious one is just a castle, and after knight f6 you throw d4 in. Because if we play pawn takes e5, we transpose into a lot of well-known lines, either after knight e4 or d5. But white has an extra move in castling, and so the position is actually substantially better for white in most instances. h6 doesn't do as much as for black as castling does for white, and that's the key thing here. The move that I would normally consider here was to take advantage of h6 as c3, with the idea of following up with d4. But weirdly enough, after knight f6, d4 takes, e takes in this case, d5, bishop b5. Again, we've got similar lines here, but the position isn't, funnily enough, as good for white as I had hoped. And after bishop b4, bishop d2 here, black's slightly worse off because the pawn on e5, just highlight the pawn on e5 here is actually cramping black's position. But as pieces come off, this becomes less and less significant. So instead, white played knight c3, and I'm not a fan of knight c3 in this position, because once we start playing these sort of moves here, we're getting back into main lines where bishop g5 would like to be played but doesn't have to be played. Might play bishop d2 here, and there is a plan behind bishop d2, but bishop e3 is a little bit more aggressive. The best move for black in positions like this is bishop b6. You don't want to exchange, and I've fallen for this in the past, because after f takes, white actually, despite the fact that white has double pawns, they're what we might call good double pawns. One, there's an open f file after we castle to attack on f7. Notice the bishop on c4 is also lined up on f7. And two, the pawn on e3 supports the d4 push. So taking is actually a bit of a mistake. Bishop b6 is better. But white played to d2, and after d6, castles. And queen c1 here. And the queen c1 idea is that you're looking at sacking on h6. Now, again, I'm looking at this game substantially from the point of view of junior players and how junior players play chess. So a move like queen c1 is surprisingly obvious and surprisingly common in junior chess, and it was an idea that I used to look at. And simply the plan is to take on h6, play queen takes h6, swing the knight over and find some way to mate. Now the key expression there is find some way to mate. Almost always there isn't actually a forced win, but there's just a hope that something good will turn up. Bishop d7 was played. Bishop g4 was probably better here because the knight on f3 isn't supported except by the pawn, and there's a threat of just playing bishop takes f3 and wrecking the pawn structure. If knight h4 to avoid that, knight d4 is not a bad idea, in part because black can play, even though it's a slow plan, bishop b4, bishop takes c3, and then looking at knight check. And there's also some tricks with knight takes e4, by the way, because of queen takes h4, because the knight is actually sitting on the edge of the board unprotected. So when you're playing chess like this, especially when you're first starting out, looking for loose pieces and looking for simple tactics like knight forks is always the go. Even after h3, bishop d7, the knight on h4 isn't so great. But after bishop d7, white played knight d5. Now what I want to look at here is bishop takes h6 straight away. Not because it necessarily works, but just to show you why it doesn't work. If you're a junior player, you're looking at, hey, I might be able to win by playing queen c1, bishop d2 type moves, bishop takes h6. Let's see where it goes wrong. Okay, queen g takes, queen takes h6. So the idea is you want to play your knight to g5, and you can't quite checkmate on h7 because of the knight on f6. So you want to play knight to d5 as well to try and swap that off. So knight g4 is actually a really good response if you can get away with it. It's guarded by the bishop in this point. So the queen's under attack if you play queen h5, king g7, and it looks a bit scary with the king out in the open, but it actually is quite hard for white to do anything here. And more importantly, black is going to play rook h8, drive the queen away, and then start attacking down on h2. You could try queen g6, taking advantage of the fact that this pawn is pinned and therefore can't take the queen. Okay, but after king h8, you can't check on h6. You've got queen h5, and then you play king to g7 again. And again, the rook's going to h8, and again, there's no clear way of winning. Just got to make sure, of course, you don't play rook h8 and fall for queen takes f7, which can be embarrassing. But once you get everything prepared, in fact, the queen sitting out here is a target rather than an asset. So white played knight d5, which kind of makes sense because you're kind of threatening this in a different way now. You're certainly threatening bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes, and then the idea of playing knight g5, knight takes f6 is a little bit quicker. So black took straight away, knight takes d5. If we play e takes d5, which is probably the right idea here, even though it looks like it's locking the bishop, knight d4, knight takes, bishop takes c3, bishop c5 is pretty equal. So white actually took with the bishop to keep the bishop on the long diagonal. And again, bishop g4 is a thought here. Instead, knight d4 came into play, and white did the same thing. And so eventually we get, after this move here, c3 to drive the bishop away, and black just went c6. And we've got an almost completely symmetrical position with one difference. The difference is black has played h6 and white has played queen c1. So black's just got to be a little bit careful of either of these bishops taking things. For example, instead of retreating the bishop, which is what happened in the game, bishop takes f7. Okay, it's a check. So you take with the rook, and then you take the bishop. And then after we take back, material is still equal. White captured a pawn on f7, and black captured a pawn on d4. But after a move like f4, white has a small space advantage. But opposite coloured bishops might leave this game a little bit drawish. So, bishop went back to b3, and then the bishop went back to b6. So we're still playing copycat here. Now, if white wanted to bail out at this point, bishop h6 can be played. After takes and takes, it's very hard to avoid a perpetual check in this position. Queen e7, you just check here. Corner, check, check, and that's it. And the games are... Excuse me, I'm about to sneeze during my own broadcast. I'll sort that one out later, or that'll come at a surprise moment. Okay, so, and that's a draw. But white was still looking for more for two reasons. White position isn't that bad. And two, as I said at the top of the broadcast, white is the older of the two brothers, and it'd be terrible if you didn't beat your younger brother. So, bishop takes a3 instead. Queen takes a3 was played, keeping the pawn structure together. Again, f takes might be better. Now, of course, let's have a look at this position. It's an interesting position simply because everything, so not everything, two knights and a bishop have been swapped off, and we're getting towards the ending. No pawns have been exchanged, though, and that's always an interesting thing. And funnily enough, I do see that a lot at junior chess level, that they play these sort of openings where the pawns don't really make contact with each other. And so there's not a lot of exchanging. The problem with no pawns being swapped off is it makes it a lot harder to work out what to do with your rooks. Rooks want open files. Open files are only created by pawns being exchanged. The only other plan, and it did happen in this game, was to try and liberate the rooks by lifting them up to the third rank. Okay, so queen to f6. Okay, f4 is again the right idea here because you're just simply threatening to take on e5, and suddenly the open f file is working in white's favour. But the queen went to g3. I'm a little bit curious about that move. Rook a d8, rook fe1. Again, the other rook is probably better placed in the centre. The other rook comes across, and rook e3. And as I said, the plan here was to lift the rook to the third rank. Okay, and at this point, whether black missed the idea or thought that it wasn't important, played bishop c8, which is a blunder, and a big blunder, because now rook f3 and the f7 pawn is under attack. Queen goes to e7, and bishop takes f7. Your other idea was rook takes f7 here, and it basically forces black to give the queen up. Because if the queen moves, there's too many discovered checks that are going to destroy you. I mean, and the only place the queen can sensibly move to in this position is g5. And then, of course, if you play queen g5, rook here is one just simple winning move because of the discovered check, and you're just going to take the queen with the rook. So the queen, you sacrifice the queen, takes, rook f1, threatening f4. And white is substantially better in this position. It might not look it in terms of material, but it is queen and pawn worth 10 points versus rook and bishop worth 8. So that's 2 pawns that are good, but in fact the position just favours white as well. Bishop takes f7 is not bad either, because after king moves, you're winning the exchange. And in this case, it's pawn and rook worth 6 versus bishop worth 3. So again, white's just easily winning here. But winning does not equal 1, as I tend to say to juniors. And white now maintains the advantage and generally plays the right moves up until it all goes wrong later. Spoilers. Queen to g6. I really did like this move because you're threatening rook f7. So bishop to e6 blocks that. Okay, and d4 again. Now looking for space in the center. You've got the advantage of the exchange. You really want to start bringing your rooks into the game. b6. D takes e5, so we've got our open files, and rook d1 is the right plan here. Okay, c5. Black is kind of also tied up here and is just starting to shuffle pieces, I think. Pawn to b3, pawn to b5, but a4 was a missed chance here. Now, I'll get to that in a second. So rook fd3 is the right move. Okay, and after a6, for example, so a6 isn't the best move, but there is a threat now of taking on e8. And I'm just going to show you by playing a waiting move like a6. a6, queen takes e8, queen takes, of course. Rook d8 pins the queen against the king. Okay, and so you've got to give the queen back. There are a number of ways, but I'm going to choose this one. Rook takes check, king up, rook here. So what white has done there is simplified the position, is going to win another pawn, and there is very little winning chances left in this position for black, and that was the key to how this game fell apart. The other reason why a4, so sometimes when you're analysing games, especially on chess.com or with your database, it'll say this isn't a great move because you've missed a better move. Now, my policy is if the move's good enough and you still win, no dramas. As much as it is a discipline to learn how to win the quickest way, just in case you miss a win entirely, it's still a discipline that it's still a policy that I think it's unfair to criticise players for not choosing the absolute super most accurate computer-based win. As long as a win will do. But the problem with a4 here isn't just that it missed rook fd3, but of course it hung the b pawn. So bishop takes b3, rook to b1, we take on a4, of course. Taking on a4 was better because black temporarily forgot that the bishop's job was to stop the rook getting to f7. They went, this is good. I'm going to take a pawn and keep my pawn structure intact. Now, one of the things I notice about junior chess, especially, I'm not saying Larry and Jerry in this case, I do juniors who are probably at a lower level than them, is that even if they start to pick up these concepts of planning, assessing the position, they still tend to fixate on just one thing rather than adding them all up. And this would be an example of black has decided the only thing they're thinking about is making sure their pawns don't get doubled and isolated. And therefore bishop takes a4 makes perfect sense. But in doing so, they've forgotten other things in the position. And I often see that when players are trying to win games. So they've got a position where essentially they can promote a pawn just by running it up the board, but they're worried about their pawn that isn't a passed pawn and is sitting back on c6 as black, and they're spending all their time trying to stop that one from getting taken when simply h5, h4, h3, h2, h1 is going to win. It's that global thinking that juniors sometimes miss early on in their careers. So we've got bishop takes a4, and the problem now is rook f7. And if the queen couldn't go to g5, this would be a catastrophe. But the queen can go to g5 because it is obviously protecting queen takes g7. But rook takes g7 is the right reply because after the exchange of queens, you want another pawn. The king goes to h7. After you go to a6, you're about to win a whole lot more pawns. And at this point, white is very comfortably in front. As long as they don't do anything too silly, they should be okay. So rook a6, bishop c2, rook takes a7, king goes to c6, rook takes b5, rook d8. Now, bit of advice I gave some of the juniors I've been coaching is sometimes you'll get a position where you've got a choice between doing something aggressive and doing something defensive. And sometimes you've got to ask yourself, is the aggressive thing I do more valuable than the defensive thing I do? And in this case, rook b6 might fall into the heading of an aggressive thing, or rook a6 check. And the defensive thing is rook d1 is mate. So you go to yourself, is checking the king more important than getting mated? Unless you can see a forced win for white, probably not getting mated is your priority here. And so white plays the right choice, or of pushing a pawn, but pushes the wrong pawn, unfortunately. h3 is a choice, but f3 was obviously a better choice because it protected the e pawn, and the king was free to go to f2, g3 as necessary. h3, of course, is one of these things, once again, where you're starting to lose track of the big picture, okay, and you're just going, oh, instant move, and, oh, yes, that's right, I've now lost that pawn. f3 could still be played, but rook takes c5, why not? King to f6, rook a6 check, forcing the king forward, king f5, and again, white is now starting to lose track of the position. f3 again is fine, and went for basically just the check. Okay, it's just a check. The hope was, I think, that the king would go to g5, and then you would play something like rook takes pawn check. King went to f4. Okay, and white can still play a good move like rook check here. King to g5. We take on. And at first that looks like you're giving away the rook, but the point is, yes, you're giving away the rook with check. King takes f6, and then rook takes e4. This ending is still winning for white. It's not winning by as much, but at a 3-pawn advantage. And plenty of safe squares for the king should be enough to win for white. But white, just again, as I said, the thing that you're doing, is it more valuable than the thing that your opponent does to you? Went here, I think, with the idea of playing the rook f7 line anyway, but rook check on the f file anyway, but with the idea that when the king goes to g5, it's not attacking the rook on f6. Good plan with one flaw. Rook d1 check, king h2, rook h1 mate. And suddenly white has gone from completely winning to losing in 2 moves simply by just not looking at checks and captures. But overall, I think the real cause of white's loss here was that they started focusing on only one specific way of winning the game and weren't focusing on what tricks their opponent still had left. And in this case, Jerry had one trick left. So it was a win for Jerry. I mean, Larry was a little bit unlucky, but Larry just needed to be able to spot the mates. But as I said, battles between brothers, especially younger brothers, against older brothers, and the younger brothers doing their best to win, can be particularly hard fought, as it was in this case. So, thanks for watching in. That was for ACT Chess Association Rapid Play from last night. We run these ones online on chess.com every Wednesday night from normally 7 p.m. unless there's a server reboot when we push them back to 7:30. I do encourage lots of ACT players to come and play in these ones. As I said, the numbers are starting to drop off, and as you will know with anything, once that downward spiral starts, it's very hard to correct. You know, we get 10 players and they go, oh, it's only 10 players, I won't play next week, and then we get 8 players, and then 2 other people won't play, and we get 6 players, and so on and so forth, which is a real shame. So thanks for tuning in. I do these broadcasts normally on Thursday mornings, the day after the tournament, at 10 a.m. on Twitch TV, and then I transfer them across to YouTube if you want to watch them on replay if you're not watching them live. So until next Thursday, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you.